am Sunil Dutt from Indian Institute of Public Administration, New Delhi, and this module I will be talking to you about is new public administration. Objectives of this lesson. The aim of this unit is to explain to you new public administration as a movement. After reading the unit, you would be able to understand the new public administration movement, outline the significance of each conference, and identify the effects of NPA, that is new public administration. The emergence of the new public administration or NPA as an alternative perspective was in a long tradition of public administration theory and thought. During the decade of 1960s, the government and its administrative arm came under heavy pressure from social and political forces for a range of issues: civil rights, higher education, social welfare, law and order, and urban infrastructure and conditions. To the academics, inadequacy of public responses to problems of poverty in the United States and to the morality of a systems analysis based war in Vietnam reflected the inadequacy of the current public administration as a thought. A conference at the Minnowbrook, Syracuse University, New York, was organized in 1968, which led to the formation of new public administration scholars concerned with the theoretical foundations, research foci, and methodological sophistication of public administration as an academic field, and those who were more action directed, more concerned with the impacts of failures of public policies, all came together at Minnowbrook. Referring to the new public administration movement as a new romanticism, Waldo says that it was a part of the rebellion of youth and the counterculture of the non-Marxian left, but the seeds had been sown much earlier, and the following may be considered the landmarks in the growth and emergence of new public administration. The Honey Report on Higher Education for Public Services 1967, the Conference on the Theory and Practice of Public Administration 1967, and thirdly the Minnowbrook Conference 1968, fourthly publication of a Toward a New Public Administration, the Minnowbrook Perspective, edited by Frank Marini 1971, and publication of Public Administration in a Times of Turbulence, edited by Dwight Waldo 1971. The above reports and publications did reflect pessimism about the state of public administration and its organizing values, conceptual frameworks, and definition of good practices inherited from the 1940s and 1950s. The inherited field adhered to a positivistic approach to phenomena and a limited view of rationally emphasized efficiency and economy to the exclusion of other values, and promoted centralized and hierarchical forms of organization. The old public administration was unable, according to its critics, to deal with rapidly changing social, economic, and political orders. The new public administration criticizes the old public administration for its lack of an explicit ideological philosophical framework, and supported an activist role for the administrators in the pursuit of social equity. Savage says, there is growing evidence that the institutions of public administration have failed to finish what they set out to do, and worse, are now suspected of aggravating or intensifying the very problems they were designed to solve. It was felt that a regenerated public administration could become relevant to an agitated society and serve as the instrument for guiding social change. Public administration was to be less insular, and more consideration would have to be given to the external relationships of public organizations and to the effects of their actions. the philosophy and values of the new public administration were best articulated in Marini's book Towards a New Public Administration, which was published in 1971, and Waldo's Public Administration in a Time of Turbulence, published in 1971. The literature of the NPA stressed four themes: relevance, values, equity, and change. The NPA was normative, rejecting the fundamental tenets of behavioralism and procedural neutrality of orthodox public administration, and supporting an activist role for the administrator in the pursuit of social equity. In this vein, Waldo supported organizational participation, decentralization, and representative bureaucracy as part of NPA movement. Organizational participation was to be a means for promoting change and dispersing power within the organization. Decentralization, like participation, was intended to disperse power and increase citizen involvement in governmental and organizational processes. Representative bureaucracy was meant to produce client-centered administration and representation of clientele interests by administrators. Proponents of the new public administration made much of value emphasis and normative foundations. The orthodoxy values of the field, which are economy, efficiency, effectiveness, responsiveness to elected officials, responsibility, they were necessary but not sufficient. Other deserving values were citizen responsiveness, worker and citizen participation in decision making, the equitable distribution of public services, and provision of a range of citizen choices and administrative responsibility for program effectiveness. With greater sensitivity to these values, public administration would become truly relevant and satisfy its primary normative premise, which is the purpose of public organization is the reduction of economic, social, and psychic suffering and the enhancement of life opportunities for those inside and outside the organization. In the new public administration field, a new breed of administrator would not make the separation of politics and administration by dint of heightened sensitivity in administrators, continued organizational development, and a desire for change, which is this new public administration might well foster a political system in which elected officials speak basically for the majority and for the privileged minorities, while courts and administrators are spokesmen for disadvantaged minorities. The new public administration reasserted a conceptual factionalism among academics of the 1960s and 1970s and generated yet another intra-field debate as to the newness, feasibility, and purpose of the contemplated changes. Some scholars argued that the new paradigm betrayed the public interest by encroaching upon authority of the elected officials. For the professional practitioner, the new value emphasis and liberation from the field's orthodoxies carried costs, especially legitimacy costs. Thus, Rosenblum wrote that liberation makes it impossible to insist that the civil servants are politically neutral in its policy sense. They may be blatant and open advocates of policy positions. Moreover, when they disagree with one another, it is clear that their technical expertise cannot be basis for their exercise of public authority. Where then will the liberated public service find its legitimacy? This was the question. New public administration explicitly argued that legitimacy would flow from advancing social equity. It is difficult to assess the effects of new public administration. Minnowbrook ideas that inspired young academics in 1968 did not always serve the line administrator. On the policy and administrative turbulence of the later 1960s and early 1970s, Campbell reflected, as the students of administration are questioning the very foundations of their discipline, The practitioners of art are being confronted by those affected by their actions. Unable to hide behind claims of professionalism, expertise, and political neutrality, the administrator found himself daily challenged by those whom he supposedly served. Commenting upon the NPA movement as a reflection of the conflict of youth versus age, Waldo further observes that children's crusades and youth movements have not on the whole written happy, brilliant pages in the history of civilization. The NPA failed to develop a coherent intellectual framework that could gather widespread support. But the Minnowbrook influence runs like a thread through the fabric of academic public administration as it evolved from the 1970s into 1980s. Rather than adding a layer or strata to these introduced earlier by the political science, policy or generic approaches, the influence of the new public administration pervades and influences them all. Now we see what Waldo says, his views on NPA. The basic themes of new public administration were participation, decentralization, and representative bureaucracy. Participation was supported both as a political process and as an organizational process. Political participation was seen as a means of dispersing power and increasing citizen involvement in the government. The movement rejected both simple majoritarianism and pluralism in favor of alternatives described by Waldo as ranging from organic communitarianism to moral and political elitism. Support for organizational participation was part of what Waldo sees as the movement's massive hostility to anything perceived as bureaucratic. It was to be a means for promoting changes and dispersing power within the organization. Decentralization, like participation, was intended to disperse power and increase citizen involvement in governmental and organizational processes. Representative democracy was meant to promote client-centered administration and representation of clientele interests by administrators. Waldo had certain misgivings on the concepts of new public administration as a movement. On participation and representative bureaucracy, he asserts that the arguments are often ad hoc and inconsistent, if not dishonest. Supporters of participation, Waldo argues, seem to assume that some invisible hand will resolve the problems of coordination, order, and survival in the new system of highly dispersed power. He finds the movement to be inconsistent in its desire to have democracy while rejecting majoritarianism and pluralism, and in effect supporting rule by the minority itself. On decentralization, Waldo points out that a cogent case can be made for centralization and that neither case is universally right or wrong. Waldo finds some validity in the anti-organizational stance of the new public administration, but he considers much of the indictment to be unfair, spurious, and above all unrealistic. He notes that most innovative techniques and technologies have been created in bureaucratic organizations, and that the era of bureaucracy has been an era of rapid change. Even if the bureaucracy serves the status quo itself is not a monolithic interest, but a diversity of interests, all of which must be served. In addressing the question of efficiency, Waldo charges that the critics attack a narrow conception of efficiency that had long been discarded. He says that there is no such thing called public philosophy, and then the problem now is to find the boundaries of public administration. In an introduction to a symposium on a second conference, Minnowbrook II, which is called, Fredrickson summarized 9 major themes developed at the first Minnowbrook conference. It was in continuation of that, which had become important aspects of public administration according to him. These are: 1. The field has shifted focus in insignificant measure from the management of agencies to policy issues. Secondly, Social equity has been added to efficiency and economy as a rationale for justification for policy positions. 3. Ethics, honesty and responsibility in government have returned again to the lexicon of public administration. Fourthly, he says the Minnowbrook perspective argued that as public needs change, government agencies often outlive their purposes. And fifth, change, not growth, has come to be understood as the more critical theoretical issue. And sixth, effective public administration has come to be defined in the context of an active and participative citizenry. Implementation moved center stage in studies of decision making in the 1950s and 1960s, but in the 1970s it came to be better understood that the more difficult challenge is to carry out decisions. And number 8, correctness of the rational model and the usefulness of the strict concept of hierarchy has been severely challenged according to him. Ninth point, he says, while pluralism continues to be widely accepted as a useful device for explaining the exercise of public power, it has ceased to be standard for the practice of public administration. In the themes we find changing focus of public administration, professionals of new public administration school were to be more attuned to public policy issues, their implementation and their social equity consequences. Professionals were to be managers of change. In meeting their responsibilities, professionals were to support open organizations, citizen participation in the policy and administrative processes, and political representation of the unrepresented segments of the society. However, some scholars such as Brown asserted that 20 years of developments has not eliminated primary problems in public administration paradigm. Brown further says, the core of the field is not adequately nourished or integrated so that it can provide anchoring for the many diverse strands of interest that public administration now has or that might become a responsibility in the future. In the same second conference at Minnowbrook, Hart thus suggests the problem for public servants is that most of their attention must be given to the practical day-to-day operations of government, but included in their responsibilities should be concern for enhancing the civic characters of all involved. But designing more responsible organization is a difficult task in view of the nature of bureaucratic organizations, which are in favor of efficiency rather than responsible actions. Although social equity and human development concerns are emphasized, yet they did not find much place at Minnowbrook II. In the second conference, the continued centrality of public management as a determinant of effective institutional performance was considered. Also considered was the possibility of structuring public administration as a design science, as suggested years earlier by Herbert Simon. According to Rosenblum, 3 developments deserving of attention involved liberation of employees, increased representation of social groupings in the public workforce, and thirdly, greater participation by public employees in administrative decisions. They felt that liberation of public employees from hierarchical authority structures was a result of extensive unionization of public employees and legal decisions favoring employees' constitutional right during the 1960s and 1970s. To them, increased representation of disadvantaged groups was made possible by changes in federal law, court decisions and societal attitudes. And greater participation by employees in decision making was facilitated by union contract provisions and also by changes in the culture of administration. This made managers more receptive to employees' views. Although by 1980s, many of the goals sought by the new public administration way back in 1968 to improve public sector performance were achieved in one form or the other. The political context had also changed in the meantime. In Graham and Rosenblum, they comment that in 1988, much more than in 1968, the politics of public personal administration does not deal with activism or equity, but with the recreating confidence in the expertise and ability of competent and politically neutral career administrators. Among the factors identified in the reports were inadequate pay, delays in job offer, paperwork, and a ceiling on opportunities. The National Commission on the Public Services in the United States, in its report in 1989, reached a pessimistic conclusion applicable to all levels of government. It said, if these trends continue, America will soon be left with a government of the mediocre, locked into careers of last resort or waiting for a chance to move on to other jobs. According to Dwight Waldo, new public administration is a major development in contemporary public administration. Its emergence was seen as an alternative perspective in a long tradition of administration theory and thought. However, it contributed disjointedly to the dialectics among competing state visions and to the availability of many paradigms in the discipline. As a body of thought, it affected the reflections of and about professionals in the public administration community. Waldo further finds some validity in the anti-organizational stance of new public administration, but he considers that much of the indictment to be unfair, spurious, and above all unrealistic, as we said earlier. Since the new public administration emerged, questions of values and ethics have remained major items in public administration.